Matt, we recently were at a academic conference together, talking about interdisciplinary studies of tattooing. I had to restrain Matt at certain points to from exercising his particular knowledge and expertise. You know, had to some people know less than you, Matt. I think from dealing with you.
Well, and some people know more than me. I mean, most people know more than me. So it's always good. But yeah, I have to be on my best behavior.
You know, stop yourself getting, threats online. You know, if you can teach it, you can live it.
This is true. Yeah. Was it your first academic conference, Tom?
First academic one. I spoke at one last year. It was more of an industry thing for the European Brewers conference. I was on a panel and moderated another one. But so I was surrounded by anoraks for the first time.
Well, you know what they say about the reason that academic discourse is so heated is because the stakes are so low, right?
And you know what? Shout out to everyone last weekend. You were all so lovely.
I had a great time, and even the people who with whom I disagreed with on some issues, I had lovely chats with afterwards. So it was very good. So you're putting some of those up on the feed, right, Tom?
Yeah. They'll be up on the Patreon if for subscribers, and if you're not a patron, you should check it out. We got some interesting academic stuff. Matt's keynote is up there. We already have one of the talks, Adam McDade's study on the role of the tattooist in being a service provider, a person, and a tattooist. But
yeah. And we'll have some of the people who spoke, because obviously the papers most of them are quite academic in tone. But we're going to try and have our favourites from that conference on to talk more. Or informally and in more of a conversational way. We're definitely going to get Adam on, for example. So yeah, keep. If you're not subscribed to the Patreon, get subscribed.
I should also probably introduce the show. I always forget to do this.
You always forget. People know. People have clicked the button. People know what they're listening to. You haven't come on in the background.
You're very welcome to Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. I am one of your hosts, Thomas O'Mahony, and I am joined by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder, and we are joined by some hotly anticipated guests. Anytime I've told people about this episode in the past couple of weeks, I've been met with, holy shit, really? I have all those books. And to be honest, I was shocked when we got this in motion, because as someone who owns all of these books, and I think I've been in maybe 3 or 4 tattoo studios in the past few years that didn't have at least one copy of them, we are very gracious to welcome the brains, the minds behind the Russian tattoo encyclopedias. Gentlemen, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'm Damon Murray. I am one half of Fuel Publishing with Stephen Sorrell. And we publish books with Russia as one of our themes.
Hi, I'm Mark Vincent. You're not alluding to my first book there. At all, I don't think. But I've been working on criminal gangs in different environments for a few years. And in my first book, I used quite a few images from the Fuel collection. So it's kind of the relationship has led on from there.
Yeah, I've been so the Russian criminal tattoo encyclopedia books, Damon, that you put out, I'm sort of the opinion that they basically are responsible for most of the last 10 years of tattoo trend. So we could talk a bit about that, but I guess we should start off by talking about with you, Mark, or both of you, about the book that you've put together, which is the Russian Criminal Tattoo Archive, which is kind of a follow-up, a compendium, an addition of some new material to those encyclopedia, which for a while were very hard to get hold of because they are out of print, right? And then you republished them. I don't know which one of you wants to go first, but do you want to talk about this new project and the new book and how it fits into sort of the legacy or the story of the books that have come before it?
I suppose I should start with that as the publisher. We've collected this work for quite a long time now. Obviously, the first book came out in 2003.
I slept on getting a first edition of it and then was really annoyed and was very, very happy when you republished them and they became cheap again. Yeah. I've got the other 2 first editions, but I never got the first edition because I sort of slept on buying it a copy. And I guess it was quite a short print run, or relatively, compared to the demand. And for a while they were many £100s on the secondary market, and I was so happy when you republished them.
I didn't get one because I was 8 years old.
Claims to fame. It sort of crept up on us, really, the kind of popularity. And I think, when we first put them out, it was one of those things where it's like, this is such an odyssey. We weren't sure which way it was going to go. And tattooing has obviously kind of mushroomed into a whole new industry since then. And but it was, it wasn't a massive thing when it first happened, and it slowly kind of crept up in popularity until the book sold out, and then we thought, well, we better get onto that.
So how did it come together? You'd been working on Russian stuff beforehand?
Me and Steve, we actually met at St Martin's. We were doing graphic design together at St Martin's College of Art, and then we went to the Royal College where we set up Fuel while we were still at college, and then we left college and started working, as Fuel with our own graphic design practice, and we did books for different publishers as part of that. And eventually, we just thought, well, we better put our money where our mouth is and start producing our own stuff, because and putting it out there. And we had to go through the kind of publishing complications of distribution and things like that. But because we were working in the area already, we kind of knew all the other elements that we had to get together.
Yeah. And how did they come together? Of like meeting? I mean, tell us the story about Danzig Baldayev, and how did that actual kind of network come together? Because these books are, and you can see this, loads of this in the new book as well. The 3 encyclopedias plus the Gulag Diaries book plus this, they're largely the kind of result of a collecting project of almost one guy, right?
Yeah, Danzig Baldayev, he was a prison guard, and Mark has done a lot of research into his background, so he's going to elaborate on this later. But he was a prison guard, and basically he was an ethnographer, and he was able to copy the tattoos of the criminals. And this is something he did at home, in his own time, and he amassed this collection. Which is what the new book is about. It's about showing his actual works on paper, whereas previously we've shown only kind of black and white, kind of very basic versions of them. These are these actual drawings which are made in ink on paper. You can see the kind of tracing pencil lines. They're really kind of visceral.
I want to get into that, because I was just absolutely ecstatic when this book arrived and reading through it, because I've become so familiar with them.
The workmanship is amazing. The draftsmanship is phenomenal, and we were sort of a friend of ours had basically put us onto him, and we produced the first book, and eventually he died, and we were sort of working with his wife, and we went over there. I went over there to St. Petersburg and met with her, and that was an interesting meeting. The only publishing meeting I've been to where there's been a gun on the table, which okay, that's how this is going to roll. But anyway,
yours or theirs?
Yeah, well, it was theirs. Yeah. But the upshot of that was, she wanted to sell the drawings. They were literally in bin bags, slowly being eaten by mice.
Yeah.
And she was like, let's do a deal. So we did a deal, and that's when we sort of brought them back, and we were able to kind of catalogue them and put them in some sort of order. And then since then, we've had exhibitions of the drawings and the photographs as well. So yeah.
Yeah, the photographs got exhibited at Saatchi Gallery, didn't they? I saw those.
That's right. Yeah, as well as we've done a couple of exhibitions in London and one in Berlin. So, and we're always sort of looking for new venues for exhibitions. Yeah,
I love a good tattoo history in a bin bag story. I've got a couple myself, and it's amazing.
I was about to ask what's with a tattoo ephemera's obsession with being stored in bin bags.
Yeah, that's you're getting quite familiar with this now, Tom, hanging around with us. So Mark, do you want to tell us tell us about Danzig Baldayev and about the context, like when is he working, where and why does this archive come together?
So I think the thing that, one of the many things that interested me the most about this project was, I think that Baldayev's background has been kind of like almost forgotten. I mean, the drawings, like as you were saying, they're incredible. And when I got to see them at Field's offices for the first time, I couldn't believe that I was looking at them with they've been nibbled at around the edges, and seeing Baldayev's annotations on the back, his notes on the various different people. So I think that there was an opportunity to really tell a story about Baldayev that had been a little missed, about his background and kind of where he originally came from. I think people are reasonably familiar with the fact that he ended up in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad, and kind of where the collection developed from there. So I wanted to do a little bit about him and his family, and kind of coming from Buryatia, which is this region in kind of like eastern Siberia, quite close to Mongolia. Essentially, like he grows up, and his family suffered repression during the 1930s. Baldayev, Danzig Baldayev, and his sister actually are both sent to orphanages in Siberia. So Danzig ends up fighting during the Second World War. It's a little unclear what he's doing during the Second World War, and then he's kind of placed in Ukraine afterwards, at a time when Ukraine is essentially kind of on lockdown because they're worried about nationalism in that region. So Baldayev, in around about 1948, I think ends up in St. Petersburg, Leningrad at the time, and he begins working as a prison guard in probably the most kind of famous prison in the Soviet Union then and Russia today. It's a place called Crosses. And he begins to develop the collection more from there. I think he'd started drawing some tattoos. We found one from 1943, so like during the war itself, when he was kind of obviously in Mongolia with the annotations on it. So the collection develops from Leningrad and from this Crosses prison in 1948.
And who's that prison? Who is that prison holding? Like who are the inmate populations? Are they dissidents, petty criminals, violent criminals? Who's going there?
It's holding a lot of everyone. Like the period after the Second World War, there is a huge amount of repression. So there are some political prisoners there. Also, it's almost like a kind of holding prison, essentially, for people to be sent off to Siberia, to other locations that make up the kind of expanse of the Gulag. So during his time as a guard at Crosses prison, I think that he experiences a lot of different prisoners. And that continues when he's moved into a kind of role for, essentially becomes kind of a police officer, really, in Leningrad. And the police at that time have access to the kind of penal institutions and Gulag camps. And he uses that access, as me and Damon and Fuel have seen, to be able to travel throughout the Soviet Union from his kind of, base in Leningrad, St. Petersburg during that time. So he experiences a huge range of different prisoners. Again, when we look through the collection, I don't think there is a nationality that's not represented by his drawings in the collection, which again is something I think that's been a little misunderstood about the archive in the past, maybe focusing on, which tattoos linked to the Russian mafia.
Yeah.
But there's tattoos from Chechnya and from Ukraine and from the Baltics as well. It really is like a kaleidoscope of different nationalities that are represented through the tattoo drawings.
Yeah. And this is what I really like about the project, actually. One of the things I love about the project in so many ways, because one of the things, in fact, I was saying this at this conference, so people can listen to my keynote on the podcast, that actually criminal tattoo archives in general, right, is one of the only places that academics have been able to access tattoo history. And so there's been this kind of myopia developed that only criminals get tattoos or whatever. But even in criminal archives, if you actually look at it properly, as you guys do and have just alluded to, there's a lot more granularity in there, right? So even in the encyclopedias, without them being signposted, there is obviously some very kind of fascist imagery. There's some very, very like pro-government, pro-communist stuff. It's a very diverse image set, which actually, as you said, if you focus on it in this very kind of myopic way of this is this is the criminals only, or this is the gangs, and people have a imaginary of what that is through film and through other kinds of media. You miss all of that kind of all of that richness of what these tattoos can tell us about the people and the places and the times that I think all tattoos can tell us, right?
I just wanted to ask, to kind of get a grounding for the conversation as we're going forward, what is the kind of cultural context for tattooing in the Soviet Union at this time, from the 1930s onwards?
I mean, the tattoos are, like, as far as I can tell, and I've done a reasonable amount of research into it, the tattoos are quite confined to the penal system, like through the 20s and the 30s. And then it's when there are kind of mass releases that happen. I think the biggest mass release happens after Stalin dies in 1953. So they are very much confined to the labor camp system, the Gulag, the precursor to the Gulag as well, in the 20s, the 30s and the 40s. And then with the mass releases in the early 1950s, that's when tattoo culture, and in fact just kind of penal and criminal culture, really kind of goes mainstream, I suppose, would be the best explanation for it.
I was going to say, I think tattooing is explicitly illegal, isn't it, in this for most of the time of the Soviet Union. Like, even in some of the records I found in Japan, there's clearly like Russian sailors are getting tattooed in Japan after the Russia-Japanese War, but there's no mainstream culture of commercial tattooing, as was developing in Britain and the United States a bit earlier, and then even in Germany and France. And we heard from Julia a few weeks ago on the podcast about Spain. Like, there's a little bit of nascent professional tattooing beginning in the 20s and 30s in the run up to World War I and in between the wars, but that doesn't really happen in the USSR, certainly not in Russia, right? Like, you haven't got tattoo shops in the same way as you might have had in London.
I mean, there is beginnings of a tattoo culture exist before the revolution. I think also quite kind of famously, although I haven't actually seen the evidence of this, Nicholas II has a tattoo.
No, he does. There's photos of him actually with his tattoos on his arm. He's one of the few aristocrats and royals who had the good grace to play tennis, and therefore we can see his tattoo on his arm.
Which I think does he get that, Matt, when he's traveling around?
Yeah, almost certainly in Japan. Lots of tattooers claim to have tattooed him, actually, as the same with, most sort of well-known. What would happen is basically some aristocrat or royal would be publicly known to be tattooed, usually in Japan. And then every tattooer from like between Hong Kong to like San Francisco would claim to have been either done it or added to it. And Nicholas II is on a few lists of, I tattooed that guy. I don't know the truth or the extent of his tattoo, but he definitely has at least one on his arm. But yeah,
there's a very similar rumor that exists about Stalin as well, and I think that the evidence is more lacking in that case.
Same with Churchill. Again, I don't think Churchill was tattooed. I hadn't heard the Stalin one, but it sort of makes sense. So, speaking of like media and presentations, I've seen that documentary, the Mark of Cain, which is set in Russian prisons, about tattooing a bit later on. Can you talk a bit about the culture of prisons then, Mark? Like, what do prisons themselves look like for inmates? I guess for guards, like, what's it like for Danzig as a guard?
So the first like kind of like camp system on a reasonable scale begins in the 1920s. There's a particular camp which is is up in kind of in the far north, and it's across an archipelago. It becomes really famous. It provides this kind of metaphor that Solzhenitsyn will use like later when he's writing his book, The Gulag Archipelago. So there's a famous camp, Solovki, and there's some documentary footage in that film that you're referring to, Matt, Alex Lambert's Mark of Cain. So they are similar in the way that they look, I suppose, to other concentration camps. In terms of they're big, they're spread over really large areas. They've got barbed wire and they've got guard towers. There is barracks rather than prisoners being confined in cells. So they are close in our imagination to what we see emerging from Germany during 1930s, 1940s. There are big differences between the two sets of kind of camp systems, but as a kind of way to imagine them. There's these huge places which are meant to be surrounded by barbed wire. That is not always the case. The inmates are supposed to be separated, particularly male and female prisoners. That is not the case either. There's a lot of prisoners travelling between different barracks. But yeah, in terms of an idea about how we might see them, I think the watchtowers, the barbed wire, the size of them as well. The biggest camp is Collimar, which is again in the far north, and I think that camp is made up of 27 different individual camps. It becomes an area the size of France. So we're talking about a kind of astronomical size compared to the penal institutions, prisons that we have in the UK.
Yeah. It's almost unimaginable, and this is sort of what I love about the tattoo history of this, is you can get access even in that kind of huge scale, as you're talking about geographically, the huge numbers of people that would have been incarcerated at any one time, and these designs like pull us out to some. I mean, I'm sort of skeptical in some ways that tattoos can tell us about individual lives, but they certainly tell us about like the lives of specific individual people, if you see what I mean. I mean, I wonder if you can, maybe this is a question for you, Damon, as well, like some of the stories or some of the kind of, life histories or some of the kind of lives, some of the emotional histories that are coming out of actually looking at these drawings. And I guess, and these tattoos, and I guess the photographs too. What kind of stories stood out to you when you first came across them, for example?
Mark, do you want to go first on that? I mean, I think for me, Mark's done more research in that area and kind of and delving into the stories. I think for me, the thing about the images, it's like you're saying, it is the scale of it is kind of unimaginable, and the images themselves are kind of unimaginable, and they don't always mean what you think they mean. Because you as a kind of person living the lives we lead, we're kind of looking at them and bringing our own assumptions to them, and that often is not the case. Like the kind of fascist stuff, it isn't necessarily fascist, but it's anti-Soviet, and similarly the kind of religious stuff is also kind of anti-Soviet, because those kind of two elements that the Soviet Union has just come out of the Second World War. Nazis, as always, were the kind of hated enemy, and so the worst thing you could do with your body, which was the only area of expression you had left as a criminal, was to make these marks. And it's the same, exactly the same with religion, with almost any sort of religion, but particularly Christian religion. The Soviet Union had a whole campaign trying to eradicate Christian religion, during the Soviet period, even up to the 1980s. So, those images are kind of striking and form quite they're quite weighted. When you look at a prisoner's body, that language is very apparent. And it doesn't always mean what you think it means.
Yeah, there was a sort of weird conversation on Twitter last week about this white supremacist murderer in Allentown, Texas, who had this swastika on him, and some people say, well, I don't think he's a white supremacist, and other people are saying, well, he's got a Nazi tattoo, he must be a white supremacist. And I sort of had to chime in and say, well, this guy, he definitely is a Nazi, but let's not assume that just because you've got a swastika tattoo on you, you're a fascist. And we've done an episode about the complexity of that exact issue. But I think it gets to something really interesting, which is, particularly in this Russian context, often I'm asked, by people, tell me what this tattoo means or this symbol means in a general sense. And I always have to say it doesn't really work like that. Of course, like in some contexts, I think they're always localized, and I think particularly some of the contexts in Russian prisons will be of this kind. There are ways in which X symbol means Y thing, but we always have to be super careful about, as you said, Damon, like making assumptions about what this stuff means, and understanding the context is exactly, I think, what people don't get. And actually, funny enough, I think interestingly, looking at these tattoos in the way that you put them together over the books and over the whole kind of context of the projects over the years, is actually you've given us context. You've been able to put these into, you've turned a story of one guy or one woman with a particular tattoo into a story of a moment in time that otherwise doesn't get talked about very much, right?
I mean, that was very interesting from the point of view of Danzig, because he was making, like Mark said, he was making those notations, and his just the relationship he had with those prisoners, you could tell that relationship was almost as an equal. There was certainly something going on there which wasn't a kind of so hierarchical that a prisoner wouldn't talk to a prison guard. And I'd have to say it's the same with having spoken to Sergei Vasilev, who's now sadly died. But I did some interviews with him, and he was, although he's a photographer, so it doesn't kind of equate quite the same, but as an outsider, he was kind of having conversations and good relationships with these criminals as well, and got to know them outside when they were released.
And I don't speak Russian, so I'm always also been very glad of the translations that you've put on these. But I spent a lot of time with European criminal tattoo documentation, and often they are just descriptions, or they're in some cases sketches. But what I love about what Baldaev did is he took the time to kind of annotate them and to explain them. And as you said, they're actually coming from a genuine conversation and interest, rather than just a quite kind of documentary panopticon of the state, which is often what these records were doing. And this, again, why I'm super excited about the archive, because so much of those notes and those conversations, which are already visible in some senses in the earlier books, become much more visible. Yeah. I don't know what you think about that, Mark.
Quite a lot about it.
Yeah.
In different ways. I think the first point is that Baldaev's father is an ethnographer, and he passes on the advice to Danzig, and he understands the importance. I mean, we've replicated some of them in the book, but both Damon and I have kind of seen how detailed some of the annotations are, or also at times there aren't any annotations at all, because it would depend on the penal institution, the place that he's visiting, his ability to remember the conversations. I think he does have a kind of like a shorthand that he uses to be able to draw the tattoos up later. But and I think that probably shorthand exists in terms of a female prisoner, 25 years old, imprisoned for this. But he's certainly, I don't think, writing out the entire biographies of each of these prisoners. So a lot of it, we're relying on his memory for the annotations as well as the tattoo drawings, and I think that comes from the advice that his father passes on to him. Danzig writes that in his versions of the tattoo books as well, about the importance of their relationship. So I think he's very, very conscious, and after a while, I think he also has the idea or plans to exhibit them as well, which is what we see with some of the huge posters that are drawn up later on in his kind of professional career. So I think he has a very, very good understanding of ethnography, but also let's try and use these. And he provides help for detective teams at times later in his life. But also, let's get them published. Let's put them on display for more people than just the police officers to see.
And was there a separate record-keeping system on enlistment, for example, not enlistment, kind of incarceration, which documented prisoners' tattoos in a more sort of record-keeping kind of way?
They're not marked down in any formal prisoner files. They're just completely missed. Wow. The prisoner files are kind of age, what they're sentenced for, ethnicity, and so on. But the only area they get close to is in terms of disabilities. Of course, they're kind of trying to make the decision, where should we send this person to, and how will they be able to kind of help out the most, I suppose. So they're not marked in any formal kind of files. Certainly not like in the Gulag camps that I've seen. But I don't think they are at police stations after arrest either. I think they would probably follow the same kind of procedures. What is interesting is that when prisoners arrive at a lot of the labour camps, when they get out to Siberia, wherever it might be, the guards separate the prisoners between who's got tattoos and who hasn't got tattoos.
Oh, wow.
So, and this is written in a lot of prisoner memoirs. So the tattoos, along with kind of prisoner slang, they become a code that not just prisoners understand, but the guards understand it, and the guards understand the importance of it. And they begin to try to keep different groups of criminal gangs away from each other for the same reasons as well. So even though they're nothing is kind of formally written down, it's almost this kind of idea that tattooing doesn't exist. Like, we don't ever record it, we don't ever write about it, and then you get to see some of the photos that emerge, and people are covered from head to toe in tattoos and across their foreheads and everything else. So nothing is really reported in the newspapers. Not even in the prisoner newspapers, which are at times quite open about other things like violence and so on happening in the camps. So yeah, it's almost like tattooing is completely invisible.
I could get very nerdy on that archival lens question, but it's a bit too nerdy for this podcast. I'll save that for when I meet you in person, Mark.
Hey, are you enjoying the show? If you really like Beneath the Skin and you want to help support us, you can do so on Patreon. For little as £5 a month, you can help make this show possible, help us buy research materials. So if you like the show and you want to support us, consider kicking us a few quid a month. And you'll get everything from bonus episodes to Q&As, and you can even vote on what tattoo I'll get when we reach a certain subscriber count. Matt, have you got anything to say?
You should really definitely fund the Patreon, because tattoo history is massive, right? Deep, wide, complicated. We're covering some big hit topics on the main feed, but on the Patreon subscriber-only feed, we'll be getting into some really more interesting, niche, deep topics you don't want to miss out on. And honestly, the chance to kind of decide what Thomas gets on his body is probably just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Subscribe, chuck us a few quid. Don't miss out on the chance to ruin Thomas's body forever.
Everyone knows that tattoo aftercare is one of the most important steps in getting a new tattoo. We all want our fresh new tattoos to heal as easily and hassle-free as possible so we can show them off to the world.
That's why Saniderm's here to help. Driven by science and innovation, Saniderm products have been thoroughly tested and used by doctors and tattoo artists alike for over 10 years.
Saniderm brings cutting-edge technology to make your tattoo healing process a breeze. No more messing around with cleaning and plastic every few hours with Saniderm's amazing range of aftercare products. I personally have used Saniderm to heal my tattoos in the past, and they made what used to be a daily process of setting reminders on my phone to clean and rewrap my tattoo into a one-step process.
Their medical-grade products include aftercare balms, soaps, and my favourite, their second skin aftercare bandages. Saniderm's tattoo bandages are designed to be waterproof, breathable, and keep your new tattoo protected from whatever the elements can throw at it, so you can get on with your day, worry-free, and confident your new tattoo will look vibrant and will heal faster.
Plus, their products are all natural and ethically sourced, so you can take comfort in knowing that you're healing your tattoos with nature's finest ingredients.
So next time you're in an artist's chair, why not try Saniderm, healing your tattoos the modern way so you can get on with your day.
Check out the link in the description of this episode for discounts on a range of Saniderm products or for more information. I was going to ask, because you kind of touched on it there, like the development of this sort of like visual language that communicates meaning through the tattoos. And I think a lot of time when people discuss this, maybe that aren't either historians or people very into the tattoo kind of side of it, they kind of over prescribe the visual language of the tattoos. I have like two questions. One, what actual symbols that had actual meaning did you see? And also, like, what were kind of some common themes that you saw?
So the first question, then, I think because of the emergence of like gangs on the streets in the 1990s and Alex Lambert's documentary and the film Eastern Promises and the Fuel publications, the tattoos that we found that have symbolism are the ones that mostly people already know about. So the stars on the top of people's kind of bodies near their shoulders and on their knees as well. I really desperately looked for any kind of tattoos, any secret code that hadn't existed before I came along to write about it, hoping that it would be there. I don't think we did. I think what we can show through the archive and through looking at the drawings is that how developed it is. But in terms of the actual symbolism, it's a lot of the same semiotics, the same symbols that people have talked about in the past. The amount of church domes representing someone's different places of incarceration or years of incarceration. So the most prominent symbols have already been replicated either through Fuels publications or through documentaries or just in, kind of mainstream BBC drama series. I remember the TV series Spooks having a kind of Russian English like double or triple agent who had the tattoos on their back as well. So we found a lot of symbols that matched up with what we already knew, but nothing that had been kind of like hidden away, I don't think.
Was there anything about criminal culture, you as a researcher of Russian criminal histories, that surprised you by getting access to these more proximate accounts of prisoners and prisoner guard relations and things like that? Like, as someone who wasn't, coming into this as a tattoo guy necessarily, were there things that surprised you?
Having suspected that there's way more to this archive than criminal gangs. Like the amount of both extremes, right? The amount of very sweet tattoos about love, and to go to the other end of that, the amount of tattoos with huge cocks on them as well. To see how loving it was and how explicit it was at the same time. I mean, I've been a historian of the Soviet Union and Russia now for nearly 10 years. And everything I've done, the whole place is full of contradictions, and the tattoo archive isn't any different. There are so many, we found so many different themes. There is a lot more about gender and sexuality than I think anyone has ever talked about in the past. There's definitely a lot more about ethnicity and nationalism. I think the main focus being on the kind of mafia groups is maybe understand why it's happened, because these gangs emerge and they're shooting each other on the streets and it's horrible and violent, but people see it as cool and sexy as well, So just to see the kind of vast array, and also to begin to understand more about prisoner society through the tattoos, which focus on gender and sexuality and nationality, and for me to try to kind of situate that alongside some of the prisoner slang as well. So I think the biggest thing that complements the tattoo archive is the dictionaries of slang. I think Danzig Baldé was responsible for publishing one of those, and other people have as well. It's been like bringing the archive into view alongside the other sources has been difficult at times because they don't match up to the archival records, going back to the point earlier. So they do match up perfectly to the memoirs, and we've got hundreds and hundreds, thousands of memoirs. But to use the dictionaries and and to match up the vocabulary with the symbolism, it just makes everything about Gulag prisoner society just fit together. I suppose it's been very much like a kind of missing piece of the puzzle that a lot of researchers of the Gulag have kind of almost like left it to the side. Because it's not a textual source. Yeah,
no, I agree. And actually, I mean, I try and do something similar to that in general in my work, and it's why I was so excited to see the archive book, because it does, for all the kind of beauty and complexity of the encyclopedias, putting these in conversations about things like gender, sexuality, nationality, political allegiance, all of these kind of things, where what happens when you put tattoos in conversation or intention with existing knowledge and existing conversations. I think that's where the real fun stuff happens. And I think also what you guys do, and I think, again, as Tom sort of alluded to, quite surprisingly, potentially, because there is this idea that in particular Russian prison tattoos are textual in a more straightforward way than some other forms of tattooing, to actually not straightforwardly read them as a text and think about them as a kind of, as a complicating piece of archive in all of their richness, I think is a really, I think you're lucky, Damon, that you found Mark and not someone who would have treated this stuff more clumsily. Because I remember years ago, I can't remember the guy's name, but I met with someone who was a Russianist who wanted to do something on tattooing, and I sort of said, look, there's a lot of work to be done here that I think is still outstanding, and he wanted to come in to the conversation at a much later moment. And I think what this brilliantly does, this book, is come in at almost at the ground floor, or certainly at the kind of mezzanine level. Like the ground floor is your brilliant encyclopedias and other books on this, Damon. And then Mark, you've come in the conversation at the right time, in the right level of access. You've not come at it trying to come at it in a more naive way. It's very serious, very complicated. as well as like dealing with the beauty of it and the hilarity of it and the grotesqueness of it and the violence and the misery and all of these things are present here. One of the things I think I really like that Mark of Cain documentary, but I think it's a very bleak watch, and actually like a lot of the joy of a perverse kind, but a lot of the kind of camaraderie and the kind of individuality or certainly the kind of complexity of individual lives that comes through in these images is quite surprising. If your image of this is just, as you said, just mafia or just bleak and repressive, and it was all of those things. But as you said, there is this love and there is this humor and there is this kind of anger and there is. I've described before. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but I've described this before. Like tattoos are, or the images people tattoo on their bodies are things they love, things they hate, and things they want to fuck. And maybe that last one is like a subset of the other two, and that covers most of it, right?
Yeah, it's just about. I mean, it's just to come back to a point you kind of made there. I think about getting Mark in. I think this is the kind of perfect book to do that because it is an archive, and I think that's kind of how we wanted to present it. And I think it's interesting what you were saying about there not being officially kind of marked down anywhere when criminals are arrested and things like that. And the only kind of real sources we have, like kind of first-hand sources, are the sources here, which are Bordayev's drawings and notations, and Sergei Vasilev's, who was a newspaper man, his photographs. And
so iconic, those photos now, aren't they? They've just become.
Beyond. And I think that they're just the kind of thing where you look at Bordayev's drawings and you just think, there's just no way anyone would have that on their body. And then you, okay, now I get it. You know what I mean? And then you've got Arkady Bronnikov, who was a kind of a policeman, security guy as well, and he collected them for a different reason, which makes the images that he has kind of separate from Vasilev's, which are much more styled, if you like, or much more kind of professional. His have the kind of vernacular aspect to them that makes them very raw and as you'd expect, a kind of headshot or a body shot to be for identification purposes. But those are the only people that are doing it. And it's interesting that Vasilev, who lived in Chelyabinsk, which is in Siberia, which is a long way from Leningrad, and he met with Bordayev and they sort of, spoke together about the tattoos because obviously they were sort of two of the only people that were doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it also speaks, this is my guess, not knowing really very much about the Soviet Union, so I'd be interested to know what you think, Mark. My sense is, the only sort of examples of this elsewhere are from places like France and Germany where prison guards did do sort of nowhere near at the scale or kind of quality of the work that Baudayev did, but there was a kind of intellectual presupposition in Germany and France and Italy, I guess, that you could tell something about someone's character from the tattoos that they bore. But I wonder if are these absent from the criminal records because that's not an intellectual. It wasn't certainly a big idea in Britain at the time. Before World War II, and I wonder the sort of authorities weren't that interested, right? But so this turns what Baldayev's doing into much more of a almost like as you said, an ethnography that comes from somewhere else other than what are these people like. It's much more of a kind of documentation of a folk art than a prison guard trying to document what kind of people he's got in front of him.
There's in terms of like criminology in the Soviet Union, there's such a huge backlash in the 1920s about anything considered to be Lombrosian.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
So because of that happening earlier, I think they almost write off anything that could be seen as being Lombrosian. For example, just doing drawings of people with tattoos. Amazing. So I think I've done a little bit of work on the 1920s and Lombrosian influences and how criminologists get kind of essentially kind of suppressed during that period. But I think that that's the kind of connecting thread, is that all of this is being recorded or not recorded because of the communist ideology, because their thoughts against certain people, certain places, and so on. So having made this big thing in the late 1920s about anything that involves drawings of tattoos equals Lombroso, I think that's why it kind of doesn't come back later until when it does in the kind of 70s and 80s. And I think when they start identifying bodies being pulled out of the river, because of their tattoos, like there's an argument there that they don't start doing that because of someone like Baldaev has been there and he's working in Leningrad and he's begun to develop this collection. So I think like Baldaev is absolutely crucial for that kind of chain to happen as well. And that idea of finding these bodies and identifying who they are because of the tattoos has almost become like every single film about the Russian mafia now. But they're only able to do that through the collection that Baldaev puts together, and the fact that him and he's joined by other people later on are beginning to help police detectives and put exhibitions on, essentially. So I think most people misunderstand that if they've ever seen a drawing of a Russian criminal tattoo, that's from Danzig Baldaev, and if it isn't, it's a really shit ripoff,
Yeah, well, that's also what makes it for such a wonderful book, because a series of books, because he's such a good artist, and actually, weirdly, they all become quite stylized in his style, right? So he has created this visual language. And I guess this brings me on to what I wanted to ask you about the legacy of these books, Damon, because obviously Baldaev's drawing all of these tattoos that would have been done, many freehand or copied from print sources, and they've become, as you said, Mark, Baldaev's drawings, because he is a great artist, right? As a great draftsman. And also why I love to see what you did in the archive book, Damon, is because I sort of suspected in some senses that you'd done a lot of digital cleaning up of the originals, like to make them work in print. But actually seeing the scans of his drawings shows me just how close your reproductions in those first encyclopedia are to the actual drawings that he was doing. So yeah, I guess my question is, like, this became, after 2003, certainly by about 2010, like the go-to, right? Like this became the post new school tattoo tradition, and like there have been people doing this kind of work beforehand. Duncan X in particular in the UK, who worked for Alex Binney, but this became like the bread and butter of of global tattooing for the last decade. I don't know. Would you agree with that assessment? And how do you feel about that? And were you surprised? And
I'll be totally honest. I've got to come clean here. I don't really know that much about tattooing.
Yeah, well, no, that's fine. That's totally fine. Yeah, that makes it better.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, we came across this collection and we saw it was a kind of a unique thing. And I think the way we've been handling it is that we kind of want to present this collection as a historical artifact and then let people understand it, try and understand the context behind it, and try and understand the situation that was going on. And how, for us, it's part of a series of books we've done on the Soviet Union and how that kind of brings us to where Russia is today, practically. So it kind of works backwards from there. But to get back to your kind of question about the tattoos themselves and their influence, sure, I get that people are totally influenced by them because we were so stunned by them. It's unbelievable. We were like, what the hell? I just can't get my head around this. We've got to, get it out there. And we understand that people have, copied them, done versions of them. Every now and then we'll see someone on Instagram with a tattoo, and we're thinking, do you really know what that means? Clearly they don't. But that's fine as well in a way. These things, they get chewed up and spat out again, and that's okay. People kind of reconsume this stuff, and it becomes something else. And the thing that attracted us about these is they kind of have a beginning and they have an end, and they're a complete world in themselves. And that world is something that it's very, very hard to understand. And the world of the criminals is just something that unless you've read in depth about it and can comprehend it, it's very tricky to kind of get any handle on it, and any handle as to why these images would be tattooed in the first place.
And have you had any? I mean, you don't have to ask in any detail, but have you had any like backlash from criminals or from prisoners or from prisons? Like, are you butting up against some things that you've sort of wandered into unwittingly, maybe?
No, the straightforward answer is no. I mean, I guess a lot of the people who are in these photographs are dead now. I mean, the life of a criminal is it's you kind of burn your candle as bright as you can and fast as you can, and then you're done. And it's kind of the consequences, who cares? And that's how they live their life. So I'd imagine, the majority of people are dead. Besides that, I mean, we work with the people that produce the work directly or their families, and it's totally fine. I mean, it's kind of all we're doing is trying to show history, really. So I think people respect that.
I think it's also like incredible that Boldaev has such a long life for a guy who's in the Soviet Union, who is also in the Second World War, and then he works in one of, I would imagine, the most kind of horrible prisons in Leningrad, and then he's moving between different penal institutions, and also even though, as you discussed earlier, Damon, about the relationship that he develops. I mean, like, it is dangerous developing that relationship. Like, once you've got that relationship in place, but there must be some trepidation about approaching people to discuss their tattoos. And what we've seen in this book and in the previous ones is that Boldaev has really good relationships with like individual high-ranking criminal prisoners, and also big, larger groups of kind of criminal prisoners as well. So, but for Boldaev to have been born in the mid 1920s and live until the early 2000s, given what the Soviet Union experiences and he experiences, I think really kind of stands out, and that also is one of the biggest reasons why this archive is so extensive and such a kind of valuable resource as well. He witnessed, like, there isn't anything that happens in the Soviet Union from the Second World War onwards that isn't included in the archive in some way. Like, we found tattoos of every single leader, a lot of other political figures. Boldaev is even drawing sketches of Putin in his kind of final years as well. So as a historian, there is nothing that happens in that period of time that isn't included in some way in a kind of mostly a explicit or satirical form. There's loads of tattoos about the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example.
We're very grateful and again, we talked a few weeks ago on the podcast with a friend of mine, Paul King, about another archive. We're very grateful to like weird, obsessive men, I have to say they are all men, probably not by chance, who actually just had that kind of encyclopedic kind of mind and that interest and that desire to write stuff down and keep it, and not afraid to get into some interesting and difficult places. And honestly, without people like Boldaev and as you said, this stuff just wouldn't have survived anywhere. So we're very grateful to these guys who are able to keep stuff safe. I wanted to ask you then, like, what's the state of Russian tattooing, and certainly Russian criminal tattooing now? Because as I understand it, we talked about this in the podcast as well, about tattooing in Japan, the criminal gangs in Japan have got much less interested in tattooing because it sort of makes being a criminal a bit harder. Now you are documentable. What does tattooing in Russia look like today?
So it looks, at least like in Moscow, the last time that I was there, and from what I've seen on Instagram since, very similar to London and Dublin and elsewhere. So the connection between mafia individuals and groups and the tattoos has changed a little. I think that the development of those like mafia groups into not legitimate businesses, but certainly like giving the guise of legitimate businesses in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when Putin comes in, has changed things somewhat. So the kind of mafia titles, the thieves-in-law titles, are now, it's almost like a kind of franchise model, where people can buy the titles and presumably buy getting the tattoos to represent the status as well. And the mafia groups in the past, at least in the 1990s, were almost entirely made up of Russians. That started to change in the 1990s. In particular, there's a lot of Chechen gangs that emerged then. But the mafia gangs that exist now are mostly non-Russian. The Russian gangs have changed into wearing business suits and so on. There's a really good book and actually like a TV series called McMafia, which kind of depicts it quite nicely. So some of the tattoos that I've seen in Moscow are on the kind of Moscow equivalent of Shoreditch. And Damon's point earlier about reflecting on someone's tattoo and thinking, do you actually know what that means? I'm not sure some of the young people in Moscow
that's so funny.
Known what these were either. So things have changed somewhat. If there is a kind of ongoing tradition of the criminal gangs, mafia gangs having tattoos, it's reverted back to one that's hidden rather than one that is really kind of overtly displayed. So things have kind of changed course in the last 20 years or so.
I guess I hadn't thought about that, but I guess of course Russian hipsters have this stuff as well. Like, of course they do. Oh, I love that. So honestly, I feel like I could talk to you for ages, but we're at like 55 minutes on the recording, Tom. Like, anything that you wanted to? Because I've talked a lot, and I could keep talking for forever.
Wouldn't be like you, Matt.
Nah.
No, I honestly, I think you've answered any question that I could have had. Like, particularly, obviously, I get tattooed a lot more often than Matt does at this stage, and just the ubiquity of those encyclopedias in tattoo shops is just astonishing. And like in people's houses, like obviously most of my friends are into tattoos. Most people I interact with are into tattoos, and it's so funny, Damon, you seeing it much more of like an archive of a art historical object than like this is a book about tattoos. And I think that's
we get people sending suggestions to us about different tattoo books regularly. Obviously we do, but for us it's not that interesting because we want that complete story. We got that complete story here. And like anything we do now is going to be secondary to this. It's not going to match up. So this is our kind of tattoo thing, and I think this is where we'll stop with tattoos as a publishing company.
I really loved your book on Soviet bus stops. Like I bought a copy for myself and a copy for my father-in-law, who's a big like concrete guy. So yeah, but I think that also speaks to why the project's so great, because it's not just quite just a book about tattoos. It's a book about people. It's a book about this very complicated, misunderstood, multifaceted, long-standing, decades-long, maybe even a century-long history that otherwise isn't very well told or represented. And I think like that's the beauty of Your Eye, Damon, and of Your Eye as well, Mark. Like just a book of. I mean, I got there was a bad review of my book on Amazon, which said it didn't have enough pictures in it, right? Which is fair enough. But like, I think sometimes people want that from tattoo books, just quote unquote just pictures, and what I love about what you guys did back in 2003, and certainly what this new book brings out, is that it's never just been just pictures, right? It's about people's lives.
I mean, I think that's the whole starting point for us, was that there's more to this than just there's more to this than extraordinary drawings and extraordinary photographs, but the combination of extraordinary drawings, extraordinary photographs, and extraordinary stories
Yeah.
it kind of makes it into a complete pitch that was sort of irresistible for us. And I understand it's not a lot of people's cup of tea, and some people are definitely not going to be into it, and tattoos, don't kind of necessarily mean what they used to mean in terms of criminality, and as we discussed. But for us, it was a complete picture, and that's why we wanted to publish it.
Yeah, so good. Did Baldaev have any tattoos of his own? Was he tattooed? Did he get tattooed? Do we know?
That's not as far as I'm aware. No. I mean, I think Mark knows more about this than me, but as far as I'm aware, it was pretty strict. You're a criminal, you've got tattoos. You're not a criminal, you have no tattoos. And the Cocks and the Roosters, is it, Mark?
Yeah.
The two groups, and they were named after sweets. The two different types of sweets that you could buy at the time, and that's why they were split, so that they could clearly identify those two groups. And it's just the two would never really mix, apart from the criminals getting the politicals to do their work for them. So
I think that it would have been a risk but I don't think that the police, the militia, people who are working for the secret services, I don't think they have a tattoo culture. But also for Baldaev, given his background as coming from a minority that were repressed, I think that the fact that he advances so much through the MVD is again kind of remarkable. So I think, and also he's kind of doing the shorthand and presumably smuggling this out of the different institutions. So for him to be tattooed as well would, I guess, be too much of a giveaway, right? So I don't think that culture exists within the militia, the MVD that he's working for during that time. And also, I think just trying to keep his head down and concentrate on building this archive. Again, it goes back to his kind of love of ethnography or understanding the importance of ethnography. I think to be able to, he realizes it's a risk to bring these notes out and to draw them up and understand where the boundaries are, where things could become too much of a danger for him, given that he's kind of from somewhere very far away from the center of the Soviet Union, where he grows up. So.
I mean, those photos of him that you publish in the book of him with prisoners, he's there in his suit or uniform, and the criminals around him with their shirts off. There is this proximateness which I really like, but there is still this separation which of the kind you mentioned. But it's really clear that he's in amongst this in a way that clearly wasn't easy, but clearly he found very exciting and very productive. There's an empathy and a humanism in his drawings that doesn't come across in a lot of, for example, those earlier versions of tattoo drawings in prisons from the sort of Lombrosian era, right? You can tell that he's, I don't know if friendly is the right word, but he's empathetic. There's some empathy in these drawings.
Yeah, and that comes across in some of the annotations as well, on the back of the drawings. The best understanding recently of the Gulag and its predecessors in Russia is that it's a reputation system, and everything is built on trust. So, once he's begun to develop that reputation for being someone who's trustworthy and loyal, then he's in with these groups essentially. Quite how long it takes him to develop that that relationship with them, and how dangerous again it must have been at the start is another question entirely. There's to go back to the previous point about Baldaev reveals a little more on some of his notes about certain prisoners that he's drawing up the tattoos of. There's a female Latvian inmate who's called Elsie. She is talking to him in the 1960s, I think it is, after her time in the camps. But Baldaev is writing his annotations on the back of her drawing, and Elsie is crying when she's talking to Baldaev about her experiences. and saying that, you know, how horrible it was for non-Russians because of the Russian prisoners. And Baldaev reflects slightly on the annotation that he understands that because he'd seen it taking place as well. I think that some of those like kind of fleeting insights that we found on the annotations were, even though we didn't find any secret symbolism that existed in terms of mafia tattoos, we found more things about the Gulag, the labor camp system, than I think has ever been expressed before in any publication.
Yeah, absolutely phenomenal. But this is going to, I think, be my last question. But otherwise, we'll talk to you forever. But like, you talked there about a tattooed woman. I think that's also something that's interesting that doesn't come up a lot certainly when we're talking about tattooed criminals. There is this, again, sort of cultural imaginary of a man. Can you talk a bit more about the tattooed women in the collection and in the archive? Because again, that's something which is so such a unique insight, I think.
So I think another thing that's been missed by scholars of the labour camp system, and scholars of the Soviet Union, or anyone looking at this collection that's we're published as the archive now, is that there's so many tattoos from female prisoners, and the female prisoner tattoos don't have the same codification. And if you look, kind of think about how the mafia is structured, there's a good reason for that, because none of the female tattoos drawings that we've seen are related, I don't think, to mafia in any way. They've got quite kind of strong rules about female participation and so on. So I think the wide variety of female tattoos has been missed, but also the link between the female tattoos and sex work in the Soviet Union as well, and about gender relations and how sex work and gender relations kind of fit together. So there are a lot of stories of female prisoners who are tattoos I think have been missed, and also again, to go back to an earlier point, how many of the tattoos are about sexuality, and I think also to return to a point that was made earlier about how female sex workers are, they're reclaiming their status. They're tattooing themselves, saying, we're female sex workers, and the kind of boldness of the tattoos as well. Some of the tattoos that we found are huge, so for them to have agency, where in the past I don't think people have really kind of discussed them in that way. I think that was another thing that we found. So Baldaev is able to essentially visit a number of female kind of correctional colonies outside St. Petersburg. He also goes to a number of kind of for recovering alcoholics, like kind of centres, detoxification centres for recovering alcoholics. A number of kind of like homeless institutions as well. So I think, again, the drawings that make up the archive don't just come from the Gulag, from prison, from prison institutions. They come from a wide variety of kind of places of confinement, if we like think about them in that sense.
Yeah, and as you said, like, I think that's probably a good place to kind of start drawing it to an end, which is something we've said all along. These are ways which allow these people to kind of communicate through time, right? Because they're not often leaving other kinds of records. They're not publishing books. Some did, of course, but these are voices which, as you said, are otherwise quite absent from the ways in which these histories are usually talked about. And it's so exciting to see such a kind of rich and in-depth use of an archive to tell those kind of stories. And I as someone who's not in any way knowledgeable about the history of Russia, or the history of the Soviet Union, or the history of Russian penal systems at all, it's so exciting to be able to access those through these images and to get a sense of what's going on in a way that otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to. So yeah, thank you. And honestly, thank you, Damon, for I really think you and Fuel are like pretty much solely responsible for the last decade and a half of tattooing. A lot of tattooers have made a lot of money, probably definitely a lot more money than you've made, I'm sure, on tattooing images that you've published. So
I need to be taxing them.
Exactly. Yeah. I think so.
But yeah, gentlemen, thanks very much for coming on the show. If you want to come back and talk more about Russian prison tattooing,
where can people get the book from?
You can buy it any good bookshop and the usual kind of online outlets, let's say. Yeah.
Cool. And it's called The Russian Criminal Tattoo Archive. Beautiful, as always, also just a beautiful book, like not just the images in it, but you put together a beautiful book, let alone the images within it. Yeah.
Thank you. Cheers.
And also you can find the guys online. There'll be a link in the description of this episode where you can buy the book. You can find them on Instagram. The Fuel Instagram page is great. I see some like great stuff, not just of tattooing, but of, concrete bus stops, that sort of thing. But I also want to thank as well our £10 and above supporters for the show. Remember, for as little as actually less than a price of a pint at this stage a month, you can support the show and get access to episodes like this early and loads and loads of bonus content and exclusive content on the paid feed. But for £10 and above, you get a shout out, and for £15, you'll get a copy of Matt's book. Postage not included. Please email Matt to sort that out. But without further ado, thank you to Morpheus Ravenna, Max C, Sigrun Braga, Sasquatch, that's a new one, Kirsten Wright, Kathleen Burkhardt, Jordan Best, Jake Fuentes, our super secret patron whose name we cannot say, and Charlie Lightning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Bye. Bye.